You are watching Co-op for Two. I'm Jesse. I'm here with Greg.
Thanks for having me on your channel.
And we've been on a sort of sabbatical for a while.
A couple months since really we did anything, actually.
Yeah, but we've been leaking out old videos, so no one knows, but we know.
We know.
And it's good to be back. It's fun.
Fun to be back. And today we are talking about IPs, or intellectual properties, which is, something like when it's based on something like a Star Trek game or a Lord of the Rings game, or,
And I have no idea what's coming.
And I don't really either, I guess. I just thought it would be kind of a fun idea. We had recently played Alien, which we'll be reviewing right after we do this little talk here, back behind me here, The Fate of the Nostromo. And, it got me kind of thinking about this whole subject. Now, at one time, board gaming, if you saw licensed property, right, on a board game, you thought,
this is going to be
garbage.
Terrible.
Stay away, right?
Yeah.
And now we're in a completely different world. And we have been for, let's face it, 10 years probably. What do you think? Like 8 or 10 years where steadily, I mean, at some point it was just like, they're going to be good, they're going to be designer games, whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, is it good? Is it bad? Is it, are there pluses and minuses to this? I just thought it might be an interesting topic to consider. Obviously, people like it, and that's huge, right? Because, you're predisposed to enjoy these things, right? Like you're like, oh, well, I like Star Wars, therefore I'll probably like this, right? But it's not always the case, you look at like something like Wings of War. You familiar with that game?
The
little miniatures game?
World War II, World War One fighter planes.
So that game, do you know what that game became?
One of the Star Wars.
An X-Wing miniatures game.
Which
at one time, Fantasy Flight, they didn't give the exact numbers, but they had said this is the best-selling game they've ever had, right? Like, hands down. Which is bonkers when you think FFG is like basically dead on arrival. It's quite a different, they didn't do so well over the years here, but the last couple of years, but they've been kind of ripped to pieces there. This is completely off this subject now.
That's okay.
But for them to have that be their biggest selling thing is pretty impressive, right?
And Wings of War wasn't that popular.
Have you ever played it?
No.
Have you ever seen a single person playing it?
No, but I've seen videos. I mean, it was getting bought and expansions coming out for it, but it was not the behemoth.
You think
what
do you think? 5%, 5% of it, 3%, 1%, probably 1%, right? So, people do like it, and then there's other things like, you look at like Runewars, which is based in the Terrinoth universe, which is
they've made that their own world of licensing out.
Yeah, Fantasy Flight kind of said, hey, we're going to make our own it's the Descent world. It's where they kind of based a lot of their games and things, which, they did this game, Runewars, and, the miniatures game, which looked really cool to me. It used that same X-Wing, not to call back to X-Wing, but it used that same sort of system. Complete flop. You could find those things like heavily discounted.
Well, they spun off a couple of Rune Wars things, right? I owned some for a while. I'm trying to remember what they were. Not the miniature game, but
Heroes of Terranoth, which was a Warhammer license.
That was the card game, but they did another one that I played.
You had the big. Yeah, and the Runewars board game, which you had.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, so that game completely failed, right? It's
discontinued.
Discontinued, right? It didn't catch on. Maybe is a better way to say it. But of course, Legion is huge, right?
I don't know what that is.
Legion, Star Wars Legion. It's very big.
Legion.
It's a miniatures game where you build the things and stuff.
You basically slap Star Wars on it. It's good. You don't have to worry about details.
So, obviously you're predisposed to enjoy that. You like those things, and if the game is good, that's great. It's a win-win for everybody, right? So, but, I think as gamers or just consumers in general, something I enjoy in gaming and in movies especially, give me something original. It's exciting. It's like every movie and book every movie that comes out is like sequel, franchise, based on a book, based on a comic book, whatever, and I like to see a bit of originality, but there is a kind of a cost for that. Now, what do you think? Do you think gamers should try to go towards IPs or go towards original mechanics?
Should gamers or game designers?
Companies, which
Oh,
would
I
determine
see.
gamers. Yeah.
There are so many games now. Like this industry has gotten so flush with good designers and stuff that you might as well every IP put out a good game for it, as long as the game is good. So I'm happy with seeing everything as a board game. Every movie, make it into a board game. If it's a good movie or a good book, go for it. It doesn't hurt it. It doesn't hurt the game.
Well, it can, but we can get to that in a little bit. Okay, so let's look at some of the things, like some of the good things like that we don't like look at, like that are maybe a little more, a little less obvious, I suppose. So do you remember we were playing Aeon's End Legacy?
Sure, I do.
Yeah, and we enjoyed that experience.
Oh, this is good that you brought this up. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and so we were playing this, and do you remember what I'm going to talk about?
Well, I remember that the story and all the characters were totally wasted on us. It was just noise.
Yeah, I mean, we were playing, and I remember like they made an effort, like while you're playing through a scenario, you would flip over cards, and they'd be like, Ezra comes in and blasts this, and they would like be like, and Shadow Man came in and did. I mean, obviously, I'm making these names up, but like he would, and I'm like, okay, I don't know who they are. I mean, I'm sure that's cool that you're making this world, and I'm sure people that are real big fans of the game are going to know that. But for me, I'm like, I have no idea. And as the story's going, I'm like, I cannot register these characters fast enough. Now it was like,
yes, that's an important point.
It's like, so there is a sort of like a bandwidth issue there, and you think like these, if it was like, Captain America throws his shield and then, Iron Man comes in and you'd be like, okay, yeah, I remember that. Okay, got it. And you would understand it like right off the bat. But like this game, which they're really trying to make their own game and do this cool thing, and then that game was enjoyable, and it had a pretty heavy story element to it.
Yes, although it wasn't critical for the game. But there was a lot of story text that was relying on you knowing 5 previous games worth of characters.
And it's not like you're watching a movie or a show or something, you're like, well, I've never heard of these characters, but I'm watching this movie now, and I can tell, you can visually see that character and think, okay, right? But you throw a bunch of names at people, you're like, that's not helping me to retain that information. So
that's true.
That's one kind of positive to it, although that's kind of a bummer because then it incentivizes people to go, always in that IP direction. The other thing is like, there is a real excitement to it. I mean, I don't know, like, when you get excited about games, Jesse, do you like, is it just the mechanisms, or is it like...
Well, I have to say, I don't get the sort of joy out of, like, we've talked about the Marvel games, and you get some real enjoyment out of being involved in the lives of these people that you like in the comic books. And maybe this is part of a bigger split. Like, I'm more in the category of the person who's likely to be upset by the way a movie represents someone that's in my mind from comic books. And in the same, I don't get upset about the games, but I don't get real pleasure out of playing the person that I like to watch in the comic book. So it doesn't do that much for me, but it does for you.
Sure. I mean, there is something like, okay, so this is kind of like, I wasn't here. I've never been to Gen Con before. And, Fantasy Flight, again, I keep mentioning them. We're at one point really the kings of the license, I think, especially those biggest licenses. So that's why I keep mentioning them. But they have they do like the in-flight report, and they revealed they were coming out with Porkins, who, if you remember, he's like one of
Is the Spider-Man?
No, it's in Star Wars, in the original Star Wars New Hope, and like he's in that. This is a spoiler alert if you've never seen Star Wars. He's in the X-wing, and he just gets like, he dies like,
he's a little heavy.
I mean, he just gets he's kind of like a silly, like, But they revealed this, and everybody went nuts. They were so excited, and that's, I mean, whenever you're in a space like that, like if you go to a movie, like I went to see Aliens, like at a film fest, and everybody's seen it a million times, and they say, get away, I bring up Aliens again, get away from her, you bitch, and then everybody's like, yeah, like,
the lines, people cheer, they cheer when the character comes on screen for the first time.
It's exciting, right? And it's
I don't cheer.
Well, you're like a curmudgeon.
Exactly.
You're hate watching. But everybody in the place can have that fun excitement, right? Instead of just being like, oh, cool, like you're playing Pandemic, like, oh, this character can do this. That's a cool power. You're not getting that. Oh, great. Like, I'm excited about this specific character. So there was a real joy for some people. Yes. And for me personally, like, it's fun, like, following living games like Marvel Crisis Protocol or Marvel Champions, where, like, I'm excited. Like, they come out with these, like, Marvel Crisis comes out with these little trailers, and it's like, here's a bunch of minis that are like, and it shows them in their little city and stuff, and you're like, those look awesome, and you get really excited. You're like, oh, they're gonna do that character that I
That's
want.
coming next. I can absolutely see that. I can see and you're waiting for your favorite superhero from a comic to get added.
It's
sure.
pretty neat. And another, I think, benefit in the IP thing, which there's clearly, as we said, a bunch of benefits, but one thing is like, other people can get excited. So I personally love all themes in board gaming. Like, I get really excited about farming in games. I love that. Or wine, making wine or something. I'm like, that's awesome. Coffee roasting or whatever, they had a game come out recently.
Quite a few games.
And I'm like, that's exciting to me, And I love, my wife and I love airline stuff and airplanes and stuff. We like to travel. And that Pan Am game, I'm like, that seems so cool to me. Like, I'm very excited about that. But I remember, I had a few friends over a number of years ago now, and I was like, oh, how about this or this or this, and it really did not get them excited when I was kind of mentioning oh, how about this game, and they really gravitated
that's the
towards...
risk, right? The risk is if you have an IP game, you've got the people who are fans already insta-buys, but then everyone else is like, I don't know that IP, I shouldn't be playing that game.
Yeah, so it's interesting because that's another, that's kind of jumping ahead a little bit here, but I kind of it's clearly very good for your game, but in some instances, maybe not so good. Have you ever seen the show The Expanse?
No.
So Jeff Engelstein, who I respect quite a bit, I think he's really great. He does a Ludology podcast. He's a contributor on the Dice Tower and stuff, and he's a game designer. He's done the Space Cadets and a bunch of other stuff. But he has a game. He designed The Expanse, and it's a board game. I think he might have an expansion for. I'm not sure, but I've never seen that show. I'm not gonna watch the show. I don't really watch shows. That makes people so mad when I say that, but it's just I concentrate on movies. But I feel like I'm not gonna play that game. It's gonna be lost on me. I'm not gonna get any of that stuff, right? And so that can be a detriment in some ways.
Yeah, and you gave 2 examples of how companies tackle that sort of differently. Aeon's End is the example of how not to do it. Even though it's not built on an existing IP, that was a game that, because we didn't know the history, we were just flooded with details that meant nothing to us. But I feel like the Marvel games do it the right way. You don't have to know any of those superheroes those Marvel games. Yeah. You got She-Hulk. You're gonna learn She-Hulk, how she plays, and you'll fully experience it. In fact, those have no backstory requirements.
Well,
right?
I can see different cards and things might do things specific things, that might be a nod to comic book.
Well, that's a good way to say it. That's what people want. When they see a movie or a show that they know some of the history of, they're like, oh, I got that. You didn't get it. You don't know the show. You didn't get it, but I got it. But it's not made so you need to know that stuff. Those are little extra things.
So there is a little bit in under the hood, and mechanism-wise, that I think does make a pretty big difference too. And I'm big on bandwidth and kind of we talk about kind of that thing where it's if one of it's actually a Jeff Engelstein thing, which is if you've got 3 pieces, one of them moves on brown spaces, one of them moves on blue, and then one of them can move on any of them, you're going to have to try to remember that. But if you say one's a helicopter, one's a tank, and one's a boat, easy. You don't have to be told that, right? And so a lot of stuff like that makes things easier, but you could see that makes things a little bit easier because, if I say, okay, well, this character's a stormtrooper, this is a stormtrooper, this is the stormtrooper captain, and this is Darth Vader, you don't have to be told that, Darth Vader, is going to do the most damage to everybody, right? And you're going to know, just the power level, right? You're going to have an idea of, I better be more careful of that piece, right? And also, you could see going into it you might gravitate towards those characters thinking oh, I'd like to play this kind of character. I might not want to play Doctor Strange casting spells and things. That seems to be too much. Maybe I just want to be Thor and I want to just smash, or Hulk and just punch and smash people and throw stuff, right? So it does kind of help you in that way. Or if the game includes flying, you're oh well, this character clearly, Captain Marvel can clearly fly, Hulk can't fly, so it can help you in terms of that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're focusing on the mechanical aspects of the things. I think that makes sense. To me, the only thing that the IPs give me that they can give you is your Darth Vader example of all of a sudden that Darth Vader thing is you now can imbue it with all of the emotion.
Sure.
and fear and all that stuff from the movie. So then all of a sudden it might feel a little more emotionally involving.
So the thing that kind of started me thinking about this whole thing was that when we're playing Alien, I was thinking about Ripley, and I'm like, so let me ask you this.
This is a good question, yeah.
So like, if you're a game designer, do you make, and you're like, here's the 5 characters that are going to be in Alien Fate of Nostromo. Do you make Ripley the strongest character because you know she's probably going to be picked a lot, and that's going to help new players? Or do you make her be not as good because you want to try to get people to try, to like play her in the beginning and then maybe use your brain to use some of the other characters? What do you think?
Right. Oh, I think you make the favorite emotional attached character that people want to play, you also make it the most powerful. It's not the best for game balance, but you're giving the reward to the person who's buying it. That's what they want. They want to play their favorite comic book hero and have that be the strong character.
That makes sense. And I mean, also I think like, you want to have a good experience the first time through, so you probably want to play the best characters, right? Now, there's a little bit of a flip side of that, because if you have a game like I just mentioned, like Marvel Crisis Protocol or like Star Wars Legion or something, if you're a game company, people are going to buy Yoda or whatever, they're going to buy Darth Vader. They might not buy some of the more B-list or C-list characters, right? And so if that's the case, do you make those characters stronger so they get purchased by
I don't
more
think
competitive
that's
players?
how they solve the problem. They solve it by being like, here's the box with the 3 characters. It's like the helper, the Star Wars chef, and Darth Vader. And so you gotta buy. I mean, Fantasy Flight has. If you imagine Fantasy Flight's workforce, right?
Yeah.
It's like, imagine 1,000 people. There's like 2 that are allowed to do their creative best and create stuff. And then there's 98% that is working the spreadsheets for how to extract the most money.
And to be fair, I mean, I get their business. They want to make sure they stay afloat and they make money and they're successful. I completely understand that.
Yeah.
Another thing is like, so just...
But I mean, like, they're the people that are like, don't put enough cards in the box to let them actually play the game.
Yeah, you got to buy the dice pack,
double sets, the extra
that's
dice packs.
But okay, so mechanism-wise too, I think like especially in like cooperative style games, it actually is very helpful to know. Like you're like, like for something like Marvel Champions, to say, okay, well, you're gonna fight, Rhino or Green Goblin, right? And then you're like, here's Thanos. Well, now you're gonna know Thanos is gonna be way harder to, like, that scenario is gonna be difficult, and you're gonna like go into that both expecting it to be difficult, so your expectations are set, and you're not going to be like, I can't believe this scenario crushed me. You're probably going to think like, oh man, we got wrecked, right?
Yeah.
And also like, you might make a night of it. Be like, all right, we've been playing for a while. How about this Saturday you come over and then we're gonna take on Thanos? It can be like sort of a fun thing, right?
It would be fun, and to combine a movie with the game.
Oh, we've talked about doing that before too, where you can make a thing where you're like, I'll put on a soundtrack for Alien while we're playing type thing, the soundtrack of the movie or something like that. And it can enhance it for those reasons as well, right?
Sure.
Also, like, it can, like, there was a big hoopla in Lord of the Rings, the card game, where a lot of people were like, they put the One Ring in the game. And people were like, it's too powerful, they shouldn't be playing with that and stuff. And I thought to myself, well, wouldn't it be strange if somebody said like, oh cool, that looks like kind of a neat game, or maybe they played the box set, like the starter box, and they didn't really go any further, they might naturally ask like, oh, what's that card do in that game? And you'd be like, oh, that's not in the game. And you'd be like, what? Like, that's kind of weird, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so you could see that could bring other people in, like, oh, that's kind of neat, that character can do that or whatever. I wonder what, like, remember when I started playing that, I thought, oh, I can't wait to play the Ents. What are the Ents going to look like in here?
Yeah, well, I mean, Lord of the Rings is a perfect game that I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on, because there's a game with a really rich actual story behind it. And how close does the game follow the story? Does it make its own alternate stories, add stories? Does it allow things to end differently?
So, I mean, there's the saga boxes which follow the story, right, of the books and films. And then there's just Fantasy Flight's own little kind of path where they make stories that kind of fit in that world, that are believable.
Are they like side quests? They're not as big, they're not as important?
It's just little stories. The game takes place between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And so, like, it's in those years which, you're just following some random heroes.
All of the game does. It never.
No, that's correct. Yeah.
It never actually treads on the actual Hobbit or.
Well, it does in the saga, but you do
in the saga.
you just do those exact events.
I see.
But that's kind of like Lord of the Rings is an interesting little. There's a few IPs that are kind of a bit weird because like people love Star Wars, people love Lord of the Rings, but like Star Wars and Marvel, and like those things are coming out with new stuff all the time. But Lord of the Rings is like, this is what you got. Mm-hmm. That's what you get. You know what I mean? They're not, for now. I mean, they're going to start making shows and stuff. But for most people, that content, and not your average person isn't going to go pick up the Silmarillion or some of these other like very dense reads that are not for everyone, right? Not as approachable. So you could see those sort of franchises having a bit more trouble, I would say. So it's going to be now. There's another one, D&D as a gaming, but it is now a franchise, and you can see that. A lot of people talk about, how Dungeons and Dragons made some board games. I know people love Lords of Waterdeep. I'm not a personal fan of it. Do you like it?
Agreed. I didn't love it. I thought it was okay. Mm-hmm.
But, that was sort of like, hey, you play D&D? Try playing this. Mm-hmm. Maybe you'll like to play.
Well, that is a really weird case about IP of Dungeons and Dragons because there's no real story lore to speak of. They're just creatures that people remember.
Right. I mean, I don't know them, but I think there are some established characters. Well, there are. Actually, I know that's not true. I do know some. Forgotten Realms has a bunch. Like
story or just characters? Like there are characters that have, or monsters that have a kind of a personality that you might get attracted to.
You could
but
read
there's
the books
no
and things,
like story like there is with Star Wars or Alien or Star Trek or whatever.
There are books that have it and stuff like that.
Yeah, but no one.
Some people do, but I think you'd have to be interested in Dungeons and Dragons to do that. But they have those D&D board games like Wrath of Ashardalon, The Legends of Drift,
whole set of them.
Ravenloft. There's a bunch of them. And
which we both played some of them, right? I kind of liked it, but didn't love it.
I like the fact that the scenarios are all very different and the components are cool and it's very streamlined to make it easy to understand, but I don't think there's enough options on your turn to make it a compelling game. But I mean, as a gateway game, you could see like,
sure.
So one way they got you going is to make board games based on that, like Lords of Waterdeep, etc., to get you going in that direction. But then they taking regular people and being like, hey, try Wrath of Ashardalon. Oh, I like this game. You like this whole thing. Well, then why don't you go into? It's a gateway into actual Dungeons and Dragons also. So they kind of have a twofold thing going on there, which is pretty interesting, just to kind of get as much out of it as they can. But you can see why that's very beneficial for people as well.
For players playing, you mean because they get open to a different new world of games that they might like?
So let's talk maybe. Oh, and then here's another one financially, like that's good. And you talk about this quite a lot. We talk about this quite a bit. The artwork.
Well, Fantasy Flight figured out that's the real benefit for the company, for the designer. They're just like, we can reuse this art. It's like a little light bulb went off, and the first guy who figured out that they could use this expensive art for 10 different games. Yeah. They probably had a bunch of years in there where they didn't pay the artist, where they could work it into the contract so that the artist got paid once. So that now the artists know their art is gonna get reused.
That actually goes a twofold. So I believe that something similar happened in Lord of the Rings, the card game, where I don't know if this has ever been like confirmed, but they were able to squeeze out an extra cycle because the Journeys in Middle Earth board game came out, and they thought, well, we'll be able to use this art in both, therefore it's worth commissioning the art, which is the most expensive thing in any of these games. Yeah. Hugely expensive, especially a game like that's so art heavy. I mean, so it can help. I mean, we joke about it.
It doesn't bother me. I think I guess I see it as us benefiting too, because we get good artwork on games that could be produced at a better rate than if they had to have bespoke artwork for each of those games.
So let's segue a little bit into some of the bad things that can come from an IP. Okay. Now we talked about one, which was the Expanse, right? Which is like,
you don't know the IP, so you don't feel
right. And then we just kind of talked about the artwork a little bit. So them getting a lot of use out of it. Well, there's a real fatigue sometimes. I mean, let's talk about Arkham, the Arkham Files games in Fantasy Flight. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? Like fatigue there?
Arkham Files. Are we? You're talking about the fatigue from the seeing the same artwork?
No, I just mean like.
Do we play Arkham Files?
So Arkham Files is the name. Sorry, I should define that. Arkham Files is the overarching name that Fantasy Flight uses for all of their Arkham Horror games.
Oh, I
That's
see.
the Arkham Horror line in Arkham Horror Files. Maybe that's what they do.
Okay.
So I'll outline them. So you got Arkham Horror the card game.
Right.
You got one-offs like Final Hour or whatever. Mm-hmm. You got Arkham Horror 3rd edition now. Mm-hmm. You have Eldritch Horror. All the expansions there and for those. Elder Sign.
Mm-hmm. Is Mansions of Madness included?
Mansions of Madness. Yeah, okay. So, and each of them have an expansion. And that's kind of nuts because
each of them have a lot of expansions.
Like you have Nyarlathotep. I always have a hard time saying his name. Let's pick something else. Excuse me. Innsmouth. Okay, you got Innsmouth. You got Dagon, Innsmouth, right? You got Innsmouth expansion for Eldritch. You got Innsmouth expansion for Arkham 3rd edition, for 2nd edition, which is past now. Arkham Horror the card game. You got it for Mansions of Madness, which I might have already said. You got like 5 or 6 different Innsmouth expansions for various games. That's a lot, right? Like, so, I mean, are you going to be excited? Like, is it which case do you think it falls in? Is it like, hey, I love this franchise, I'm going to play all these games? Or do you think like it's too much? Or is it like, hey, I get to pick the game that suits my gaming needs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's interesting because the Cthulhu Lovecraft stuff is so overdone these days that there's a little bit of exhaustion from that. It is hard to get excited about the 3rd Innsmouth expansion, but I guess I feel the same way about the reasoning of the art. It doesn't really negatively impact me, but I could see how there would be some fatigue. What about you? Do you
well,
feel
I mean, like I'm a Star Wars fan of old. I mean, like George Lucas and Disney have ground away, like really punished me for being a fan over the years. So I'm not really into it anymore. Like I'm just kind of done with. I've made my peace and moved on. But you think about it, like Fantasy Flight again. We keep listing them, but there are 2 miniatures games. There's Imperial Assault and Legion. Then you have 2 miniature ship games, which is X-Wing the Miniatures game and Armada, which all of these games are like continual releases, not Imperial Assault is done, but the others, like every month you're getting releases or whatever. Well, maybe not. That's Armada isn't, but whatever. You're getting a consistent releases. And then you have you had the Living Card game for many years, right? Coming out like a month-to-month basis. That's done now, but then you've got like board games that they've got like what's the one that came,
the Star Wars one?
Yeah, there was like
there's a 2-player
Outer Rim. That's what I'm trying.
Oh, Outer Rim. That's another one. But there was another one besides Outer Rim. Remember that, where you played either the Imperial or the Rebel side?
Oh, the Rebellion. Yeah, that's a really great game. So I'm just saying, like, there's like that's like a bunch of games, constantly coming out for Star Wars. You made me think of 2 things. The first is there is really what does happen to me is there is a real suspicion that the company is trying, when some of these things happen, that they're trying to milk the franchise to get you to buy games that aren't very good, and that definitely happens with these franchises. Like, and the feeling that they can just put out expansion after expansion after expansion, and you're going to buy it because you're in on the IP. So I don't mind that if it's good, but I do start out with a very high suspicion. But you did make me think of one other thing. Back to your question of like when Eldritch Horror has an expansion, like in Innsmouth, and Mansions of Madness has one, and Arkham Horror, there is a positive side of that for me. Which is, I play a lot of board games to see how mechanics are tackled. And in the same way that having a new edition and seeing, well, how does the new edition change and tweak and modify, it's actually interesting from a design perspective to see, well, how is Eldritch going to tackle this? How do the mechanics map to this? And having the same sort of IP area lets you compare, like what's the different way that Arkham handles it than Eldritch, and that is interesting. Yeah, and from a business standpoint, you had mentioned that they're milking it. But a licensing fee. I don't know if people know how this works, but like if you want to license, Creature of the Black Lagoon, for example, and you're like, okay, Universal, here's $10,000 for the license to make, Creature of the Black Lagoon shirts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you got to pay, whatever. Maybe you sell this shirt for $20, and you have to pay them another $2, right? Well, guess what? If you make 5 different shirts, well, now it only costs you $2,000 per shirt because you spread that $10,000 licensing fee over a number of things. Now you still have to pay a percentage on each of those, but you could see that that's a way to like cut the cost down
Mm-hmm.
and actually bring the cost down for the consumer as well. So if you have 5 different Star Wars games and each of them takes $25,000, right, out of that big licensing fee that they got to pay, right, that actually brings the cost down for the consumer quite a bit. So it's actually like great.
Okay.
So you could see where you could bring people better artwork, games that they want to play with characters they want to play. That might be the only way to do it from a business standpoint, is to make a number of products, right? So if you get a license for something, you're going to be churning out, let's make glasses, let's make shirts, let's make shower curtains, because you're dividing that, that large.
You're getting
licensing.
the most sales out of that
And
licensing.
You got to imagine something like Star Wars and Marvel and things like that are got to be really big licensing like fees, right?
Huge.
I mean, right now they're huge, which is why people want them, right? Because they're so popular.
But that's partly why the suspicion gets triggered, because this company is going to try to milk this franchise that they're licensing for as much as they can, and they're going to try to sell everything.
Yeah. So what about like a game like? Do you remember Firefly came out?
I do remember Firefly, a couple editions of Firefly, and one of them was quite a well-regarded
Really?
co-op, I believe.
I think the first big Firefly game, it seemed to be very divisive, which you seem to like quite a bit. We've talked about that before on the channel, but I think maybe it wasn't the best game, and a lot of people disliked it, and I think a lot of people wanted to like it, and they said it was good because they love Firefly so much. So
You've just raised a really a little clue, an important clue, and this triggers a little bit the suspicion. When part of the suspicion as a gamer about a licensed game is that cannot be a niche game.
Yeah.
They are going to have to sell a lot of those. So you already start out with some presumption that a licensed game is probably going to be a mass market appeal game. And that's a very reasonable suspicion to have, but that already makes it a little unappealing, right? Because you're looking for a game that's really going to speak to you. If you're looking for a game that's really going to speak to you.
I mean, if you're watching this channel, like we're all like real heavily into the hobby, and we're
a little jaded, and that means you probably don't want the mass market game. Like the mass market game is not going to be one that you're going to be your favorite game. Those are contradictory goals, and so that does mean that IP franchise games are probably not going to be your favorite games. They're not going to be the best games typically, although occasionally.
Well, I think I think you're predisposed to like that, so maybe designing a decent game goes a lot farther, if the license is something that you really enjoy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, occasionally it works. Like you get the Lord of the Rings. That's not a mass market game.
So, like, I mean, it's interesting because that game Lord of the Rings card game has, sunsetted, right? But people are like, well, the show's coming out. It's this huge, that's a whole other thing, but I mean, that's the money they spent on that is astronomical. But it's like, is that going to breathe new life into this? So will we see more life in this game because, like, will they continue reprinting this because there's going to be more interest in Lord of the Rings?
Now, so Lord of the Rings is a card game, and then Journey to Middle Earth, right? Those are both not mass market games, especially your card game, your living card game. That cannot be touched. If someone bought that for their family, they'd be in a lot of trouble. Journey to Middle Earth a little bit better, but still, that's odd, isn't it? Are there mass market games for Lord of the Rings franchise for fantasy?
For sure,
flight?
Yeah. There's a lot of them. Well, I mean, there's that original co-op.
Oh, sure,
that's
that's Kinesia. That's
but
that's a weird situation.
Yeah, and I'm like drawing a blank right now, but I know there are others, and that's I'm
Okay, but yeah, I mean that's a little bit of an exception for me, I think. Although I guess the Star Wars
well,
games
I mean, you look at
are mass
Rebellion. We spoke
market.
about Rebellion. Rebellion is a very in-depth game.
Yeah, you're right.
It's
Maybe
really
I'm wrong
well.
about it. Maybe it's the one-offs. Maybe Fantasy Flight is more serious about their franchise making. They're not afraid to make niche games, but the little one-offs tend to be like mass market.
So we mentioned
like
Rebellion.
all the little Prospero Hall games we've played. Those are all little one-off. Clearly going to appeal to mass market.
Yeah. So the Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire, that's another interesting one. Like and this is sort of a mechanism thing too. So in that game, you're each one of the specific houses. You have a hand of characters, and you're in this little world. But there are things about that game that are really some of the coolest parts that you would not understand, and really wouldn't be digestible as a gamer. Like the wildlings will attack from the north once every round, and you all have to send people up to the Night's Watch. If you didn't know anything about Song of Ice and Fire, you wouldn't understand that, and it would be a very confusing component for you. But that's one of the coolest parts of that game, is that, and the fact that somebody's on the throne, somebody's the hand, somebody has the Night's Watch, and those people have benefits or influence on the kingdom based on having those roles. So it's really kind of cool to see, that that game is phenomenally designed. I think it's a really great game.
I'm not playing it.
I mean, it's hard to get 6 people together to play a long game like that. I mean, that's like a Twilight Imperium type thing where it's it's going to take a long while. Maybe not quite as long, but But I mean, that is digestible because you know that world, and not only is it the bandwidth solved that you understand it, but also it's enhances your enjoyment because you do understand it. So that's kind of a cool thing. But,
For sure, I can see that.
So, just speaking about IPs in general, it's like, well, are they going to make more? I mean, now a little bit on the some Fast and Furious. That's one of the biggest franchises there are. We recently played a game.
Yes, we did.
Going completely against the grain of everything we've kind of talked about so far. We do not care about that at all. I've only ever seen one of the movies. It wasn't really my idea, and we loved that game.
Yes, but getting back to your previous points, there was a game that there was no need to know anything about the franchise at all. The characters were sort of abstract drawings on the sheets, but we didn't need to know anything about their personalities, their characters, story, nothing. It was just slapped on, but it was slapped on a good game.
Well, you say that, but I mean,
pasted on. What's the phrase?
Yeah,
it's that IP was totally pasted onto that.
And then you got one of the other huge franchises that exist. James Bond is one of the biggest money makers in any movie franchise of all time, like top 5, top 3, something. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Name me one James Bond game.
That's fascinating. Video games for sure, but board games don't. Now that is a fascinating question.
Yeah.
Why do you think that would be?
I have no idea. And I looked up, I Googled before this.
That's very odd.
Whatever, a week ago when I first thought of this or whatever, I just Googled top franchises, and I just looked whatever Google came up with first. And it's weird because there's some they had Anpanam Man. I was on their top 10. I'm like, I'm now irrelevant. I'm an old man. I have no idea what that is at all. What are the kids playing? Anpanam? I can't even say it. I have no idea. But it's some weird. I have no idea. It's like this is one of the
some
top
Indian? Because remember, there's more Indians and Chinese that we.
Yeah, that's true. So that one, and then there's a couple of interesting IPs to me, like Pokemon, which started as a game, and now it's one of the biggest IPs in the world, and yet it's like everything else. It kind of went the other direction. It's one of the few things to have done that.
Some companies are very controlled in their how they let their IP get used, but James Bond did go for video games. I don't know why they wouldn't go for board games.
And then one last thing, just to kind of touch on, for Kickstarters and stuff, Conan, huge Kickstarter, like a massive Kickstarter, right? So then they went with Solomon Kane, Batman. Monolith Games put out Batman, the game miniatures game, and those were huge Kickstarters.
Ton of
they
DC
gave you a
licensed stuff.
ton of stuff in the you got boxes and boxes and boxes of miniatures. Is that a good thing or is it a bad thing?
That does seem like, I mean, we have no business talking about the business of these things, but it does seem like an odd choice.
Yeah.
If you're going to pay for the license for Conan, that you would do it in a Kickstarter. That does seem odd to me. It seems like you'd be better off doing a more mass-produced game. What other franchise games do we like? Like Alien has a bunch of games, and
It
you
seems like
you
they're
have
adding more
another
and more,
one that
yeah.
I want to play that you've been painting up.
Oh yeah, Aliens. Another day in the another glorious day in the core. Yeah, I painted that up, and I'm looking forward to playing that. But I mean, I bought that. I was in a game shop in Chicago, and like I just happened to see that, and it was not on my radar at all. And I was like, they had like Bishop, and they had like Bishop that was ripped in half, and I was like, I have to get that. I was like completely in, and that's. I mean, I was so, and that's one. I rarely buy a game. Like I maybe 10 times I bought a game before that I didn't like rigorously watch reviews and really screen it. But that was, I was completely like done.
It's interesting that one of the real benefits to some of these franchises for these painted miniatures for me is I've painted the Mansions of Madness miniatures. One of the few really big painting jobs I've done, and I love the idea that I could use those painted miniatures in other games in this franchise. Like we use them when we play Arkham LCG, and I love that. I wish there was more of that. I wish like they had a game where whole series where you could just paint the set once and reuse it.
That was a frustration with Imperial Assault people that invested heavily in that game,
and then they changed.
And then
the
Legion
size.
came out and they changed the size.
That's
so
upsetting.
I mean, there's nothing to whatever. Yeah, but I mean, painting stuff is a very large investment. We just got the X-Men, or X-Men Kickstarter for X-Men United.
Marvel
and
United.
just watching. Well, I did the X-Men United one,
okay.
And like it's like, watching all those unlocks of those characters that I love. If those were just like normal zombies and things, I guess the Zombicide world seems to work pretty well too. But I don't know. So the whole thing is very interesting to me. I think there are some benefits and some negatives to the whole IP thing. There are I find it more interesting the whole and we didn't delve into this too much, but if you're a designer, how are you putting those things in? Are you really geared up to say, here's a fight, like when I'm playing Lord of the Rings and there's a Nazgul and I'm like, okay, this is gonna be tough, right? Or here's Thanos, that's gonna be tough. I like those kind of decisions. I'm going to pick Ripley. I'm going to pick this character, I'm going to pick Luke Skywalker, because they're going to be
Well,
good.
when we played Marvel United, and similarly, especially with the superhero games, though, when I play with you, there are moments where you're like, oh, that's cool. That is because of that character. Like the Ant-Man gets big and he's got the double width card. Like occasionally they get something right that captures the spirit of it, and that produces those little moments of enjoyment where you're like, oh yeah, that matches how that character should play. So those are fun. And I think part of the franchise stuff is it is easy to get cynical about it. I get cynical about the remakes and stuff, milking it, and I feel like they're pushing it too far. But part of it is sort of like with these things is sort of like you give in to the sort of cheesiness of these things, and you sell your soul a little bit to the devil. You're like, all right, I'm just gonna pretend this is all making sense because I'll get the enjoyment of being in this world I know and seeing things continue and seeing characters come back. So it's a little bit of deceiving yourself into thinking that's a good quality movie and enjoying it.
I think that makes sense a little bit. So in general, I think IPs can be really good to draw people in to the game, or to convince your friends to play, or to make it more approachable for everybody. It can help on bandwidth issues in terms of the mechanisms and things like that, or to know what to expect from a game. There are some downsides, maybe people will be prone to buy or support or like a game that isn't very good because they like the IP and that's all they've got in the case of certain franchises. Or you might not know the franchise and it might keep you from trying a really good game. Oh, Harry Potter's one I forgot about.
Oh yeah,
that Harry Potter each
games.
book gets a little more interesting, but I don't
cool.
know Harry Potter really, so that's kind of a bummer for me. And then also can give you something really big to look forward to, like when releases come out and you're looking forward to those releases of those characters or stories that you'd really like to see. So there are some real benefits there. And then for the companies, of course, to be able to reuse that art, sell bet more games in the terms of Wings of War versus X-Wing, or Dune, the Dune board game versus Imperius Rex, that, that whole thing.
Yeah.
So there are some definite benefits, and some larger fees associated for the companies as well. So all in all, it's pretty interesting to me. It'd be interesting to see what kind of other IPs come out. I mean, Hollywood is really dedicated to the sure money of buying.
Yeah, you've made me think you've made me, like you go to a premiere of something or whatever, and you could, at least I could feel myself on a path, and I can choose the cynical path, or I can choose to just or you can choose to sort of embrace the experience and the people get dressed up, and I have a harder time going that route, but. It's wonderful to see people get their inner child, and they'll be they'll dress up for the premiere and their favorite character, whatever. And I think a lot of that would capture how I feel about these franchise games, which is if you can get yourself into that mode where you're emotionally enjoying the experience of remembering the movie or the book, then the game gives that back to you, and you'll be rewarded by that. But you have to be in that mindset. You have to go in there saying, we're going to be little kids and be sort of geek out, or whatever the word, become fanboys of the IP, and then it rewards you for that.
So actually, I was going to ask you real fast before we do, see if you got any closing thoughts here. Battlestar Galactica, beloved game. People love it. It's one of the iconic games in board gaming history, right? Mm-hmm. They're redoing it as Fathom in the Lovecraftian world. I mean,
that's right,
thoughts?
they are. Well, Battlestar Galactica was a game I played and liked quite a bit. It's got a traitor stuff. It wasn't perfect. It had some length issues. And then there were a couple expansions that I wanted to play, and I almost rebought it. But it went out of print. And so, number one, I'm excited that it's back in print. But now to be back in print with the Lovecraft stuff I think it's exciting. I'm interested in trying it. And I like that FFG tweaks things. Like when they release a new edition of Arkham Horror 3rd, they made real changes to it. So I'm curious to see if they'll improve it. It appeals to me more than the Battlestar Galactica IP. I have no interest in that world. So I'm happy about that.
But you enjoyed that game despite the...
That's right.
Interesting. Any IP you want to see?
Well, what about you? Are you looking forward to that game?
I mean, I
don't care.
I'm never going to play that kind of a game. Too many people.
You always say you're never going to play, and you end up playing it, and it's usually the next day. It was like Pandemic Legacy 3. I'm never going to play that, and then the next I get an email the next day you play it. These things happen.
But we had to do a split to do that. Are there any licenses that you'd be excited about seeing?
I don't really think about it in that way. I mean, I don't look to them. And in fact, my suspicions are so high that they're going to come out with a bad game that I'm always a little worried. So I can't think of any. I'm happy with, I'd like to play a good Alien game.
Well, we got one we played with.
What about you? You got IP you're looking forward to?
And then we've got that one on deck that I'd like to play with. There's my favorite 3 IPs exist in the gaming world right now, and actually all 3 as LCGs, which is kind of cool. Okay. And that's Lord of the Rings, Lovecraft, and Marvel. I think those are my favorite.
Those are all out. So, but what about new stuff?
Well, I'm excited about the Dune thing. I think it would be cool to play a James Bond style game, but I don't know if that'd be more
James Bond is now. The Dune, we shouldn't get into conversation, but I just recently reread it, and I don't get it. I don't get the appeal of it. It's cool. There's some Fremen interesting political stuff, but okay. But so I have no, I thought the original movies were good too, so I don't see any need to redo it. But, okay. All right, but you have no other IP you'd like to see?
Isn't that funny? I couldn't really think of a good one, and you know what? It's kind of, I guess I would like it more monster movies or something. They had a Jason game came out, and it was it looked like a hot mess.
There was a camp one where you're running around camp. It was 1v all.
It
wasn't that bad.
Jason thing, but I would it looked like a mess to me, like a really
Well, you're a huge horror fan, and there isn't enough actual horror board games.
Yeah.
It would
it's
be
all
nice
zombies.
to see. It's
so
all
I would
zombies.
like to see more. So I guess I'll go with that, I suppose.
Yeah.
But Prospero Hall has been kind of putting out these little like treats, which
They just got a big stack of ideas and prototypes. When a company comes in, they'll just pick the right one off the wall.
Yeah. Final thoughts, Jesse?
I stick with my final thoughts before. If you can commit to sort of embracing the fun of going to a premiere and being the kid, then you can get out of it. But don't try playing the franchise games unless you can do that.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for. I don't know what's the thing I can say that doesn't give me Joel.
You're not allowed to say thanks for watching.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today, and it's good to be back, Jesse.
It's good to be back.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we'll see you guys next time. Now remember, the trick is not to like do it like you're giving a live talk. Like just roll with the mistakes. Don't do 100 retakes. All right, so what are we doing today?
Well, today we're going to have a little one of our discussion pieces. This one is on IPs, which is intellectual properties. For those who do not know. Can we start again, please?